So, wanted to begin today by basically talking about process ontology, what that is, what are the sort of rivals of the type of ontology that we're investigating, that is, if not process ontology, what has been dominant within the historical ontological trend of philosophy, why we should take process ontology as an alternative to the historical precedent of, say, substance or object ontology, and what are some sort of examples of process ontology? How can this be used in domains of, say, identity theory, causation, and, say, human agency or human perception? Because I think that process ontology is going to be sort of more suitable towards answering a lot of these types of questions than, say, the alternative paradigms. So anyways, to begin with this, and what is process ontology, I wanted to say, first of all, what process ontology is not, and what the sort of historical dominant trend is before process ontology. And the first thing I wanted to note is that it seems as though, right, that most of history is predominantly orientated towards objects, and substances. That is, when we look in the world, we don't see a set of processes necessarily. We see a set of objects. We see my computer. We see my mailbox. We see a couch. We see human beings. They seem to have an identity that persists and resists throughout time. They do have some demarcation point. That is, we can divide between object A and object B. And these things seem to have like this... these objects seem to have what we generally call in philosophy a sort of subject predicate relationship, right? We can talk about objects, call whatever type of object they are, let's say a tree or house or chair, and we can attach various predications on it, such as it being brown, or it being long, or it being hard, or it emitting heat, right? These are various types of predications. And I want to say that this is, in a way, sort of misguided. We can find sort of counterexamples to where object-orientated ontology cannot work. That is, we can't always attach predications onto a subject, and that subject being really an object. And the sort of ontological containment that we have with objects seems to also be misguided. What do I mean by ontological containment? I mean that we can contain whatever that we're talking about in some sort of location or ontological boundary, that we can talk about X over its relationship to its external parts or its external processes. And that form of demarcation point might be a little bit harder, although I don't want to abandon all forms of ontological containment, just to offer a definition of what I mean by ontological containment. So the types of philosophers that would generally defend the form of substance ontology of what we want to attack and what we want to go against would be perhaps philosophers like Aristotle, whom championed the notion of substance ontology. Here we have the sort of, again, background identity over and above, say, its accidents. Another even more larger champion of the sort of irreducible, or say irreducible simples, I guess, things that can't be broken up further, might be Democritus or Leibniz, especially with the monadology, because monads are irreducible in simples. And here I want to sort of attack that substance or object-orientated ontology altogether. So who are the sort of people that I want to bring up in process ontology? Well, I want to bring up people like Kant, Schelling, Hegel, Friedrich Nietzsche, a little bit less that I know of is Whitehead, Bergson, and Martin Heidegger, who I do know a little bit of, the last one, and what their general solutions to this sort of problem are. And so now that we got the sort of substance and object-orientated ontology out the way, we can sort of describe what a process is. So if a substance is something that is static, unchanging, or at least its fundamental aspect, its essence is unchanging, then it is a species of ontologies that we'll call beings, right, or a being, instead of a species of ontologies that we'll call becomings, or more to the line of what I'm talking about, extended becomings, because all processes, as we soon shall find out, are temporally extended, and therefore the only way of making sense of processes under my metaphysical view is to think that we shouldn't be thinking of objects as the most primitive aspect, phenomenological primitive aspect of the world, but rather processes are a species of becomings that have no strict cutoff point of where they begin or end, but rather are something that's temporally extended and generally work in a sort of repertoire with other processes for mostly in a repertoire with other processes as sort of being what they are. So that they're temporally extended instead of sort of cut off. So generally when we're talking about processes as causing other things, there isn't necessarily one portion of time where it's causing certain types of things. It's rather that things are being caused throughout this extended period of time. So tornadoes, right, are actively causing certain types of things. They're active processes there. Certainly when we talk about biological entities, such as metabolism, homeostasis, as a matter of fact, as soon as these processes stop, we see what we fundamentally know in biology is death, right? Some form of thermodynamic equilibrium. So we want to sort of avoid this this notion that we're in any form of stasis, and that this is a sort of temporal notion altogether. Anyways, so let's get on to a sort of definition, a working definition that I've been working with about what exactly is a process. And I think this is going to be sort of probably the most important part of this sort of thing. So I'll probably write down this definition for all of you to see. Let me find it, because the working definition that I have, I think it's better written than I can say it right now. No, here, it's going to be here somewhere. Okay, so here's one. Here is hopefully one way of where I can pull this up and put a text up for everyone to see. Oops, don't want to move the alert box. Hopefully it will allow me to. It might not actually allow me to do that, huh? Yeah, it's really extended. Jesus. If we can't do it, we can't do it, but I'm going to try tinkering with it. Yeah, it's too long. It's too long. Okay, so let me give the definition some other way. Let me sound it out then. So the notion of what I mean by a process is going to be elaborated in various themes throughout this sort of lecture that I'm about to give. But including in the again in the domains of identity, causation, its relation to biology, but a sort of preliminary definition is that it's a species of becomings, temporally extended in time, continuous, subjectless, non-permanent, and not located in any particular temporal or spatial point, from which it follows that the process is phenomenologically and primitively non-discrete. To offer some examples that have been used by certain types of philosophers that I like, such as Dupree and Nicholson, and perhaps even Mumford, are rain, tornadoes, electricity, the wind. And we should note that each of these sorts of examples don't belong to any particular thing and does not designate a particular time frame. in fact, that the processual entity has an extended and continuous time frame, about which I'll speak more in depth. So what do I mean by all these things? What do I mean by it being non-discrete, right? So they're either we phenomenologically hold in our ontology or phenomenology that things are primitively discrete, or they're primitively continuous. And here I'll be holding on that things are most likely primitively continuous, right? That when we're talking about processes, they're more so continuous than discrete. And we can think of discrete points, obviously, and what that would mean and what it means not to be that. So processes must also be viewed dynamically, that there is no set of processes that could sort of exist fundamentally without a sort of reciprocity, or a sort of reciprocal, I can't even pronounce it, sort of a reciprocity of relations between each other. And that generally when these processes are entangled, will create a identity of some sort. That is what I'm saying, is that no processes seem to exist in a sort of isolated system. And I'm generally against the idea that identities are strictly going to be the same exact thing, or are going to have some sort of essential property that's going to resist and persist throughout all of their working life. So yeah, that to that. So let's offer some sort of examples of what we mean by this in dynamic systems and material incompatibility. And I wanted to sort of offer an example of, say, an eddy in a stream. So an eddy in a stream, let's see if we can actually pull up a picture of what an eddy is. I'm sure most of you know what eddies are. And if not, they're the sort of swirling vortex that we see in good old river systems or in fluid dynamics. Right? So just a general example, I think that brings up the aspect of process ontology and brings it a little bit more home to us. So we're generally, again, seeing sort of a world of objects, or Heidegger might call these sort of precedent hand entities. And we think of strict demarcations or discrete points. But one of the philosophers, right, Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph Schelling, sort of wants to invite a different type of example. He wrote this within the Ideas for a Philosophy of Nature in the year, I think, 1800, actually. And a sort of example of an eddy within a system sort of shows the non-permanence of identities, or the non-permanence of objects themselves. Since we can consider the eddy a sort of object unto itself, but an object that we can kind of see as fading and temporal and always changing. We want to see this kind of Heraclitean entity right here. So consider the example of an eddy in a stream and how its identity is formed. Only through a constant renewal of its inside, by intaking and outtaking its content dynamically, can an eddy be said to be an eddy. Such a view, I think, is actually sort of fundamental to life, as I've said before. And this sort of runs in opposition to substance ontology, in that processes do not seem to be reducible to, this type of ontology in terms of the eddy, right? There's a very good quote by Schelling on the eddy. Think of a stream which is pure identity. Where it meets resistance, it forms an eddy. The eddy has no permanence, but is constantly disappearing and reappearing. Originally, nothing in nature is differentiated, and all that she produces is at this point unseen and dissolved in the general productive potential. Only when there are points of resistance are nature's products gradually precipitated out, emerging from the general identity. And at every such point, the flow is broken up, so that productivity is destroyed. But at each moment, a new wave arrives, which fills the sphere afresh. All right, so here we get, I think, a pretty good image of what process ontology is meant to do. In that, let's look at, again, the Eddy and see what's going on there. There are definitely types of fluid dynamics working, right? The fluid dynamics are, in a sense, working to go linearly forward until they meet some sort of resistance. That resistance might be, say, a rock of some sort that pushes the waves or the fluids basically to go one way or another, and then eventually creating a sort of swirling vortex. And this constant dynamic or this constant tension between these two different types of processes, say being resisted and acting upon that form of resistance, creates this sort of vortex, right? So it's this sort of dynamic repertoire of these various types of processes working in a sort of union, or whatever you want to call it, is what's creating the identity. It's what's creating the product, or the productivity is what's creating the product. It is not simply that we start within the sort of assumption that objects are just the most primitive types of things within the world, but the objects themselves are created by a sort of composite or by a sort of dynamic of various types of processes working together. The object itself isn't primary, but is an actual indirect byproduct of the sort of conflicting processes. So then we get onto the idea of what Schelling means by nature at first being non-differentiated, right? So he basically thinks that, as with all German idealists, is that if we think of the world as one giant blob or one homogeneous thing, right, there is no opposition, there are no dynamics, there are no conflicting activities. As a matter of fact, this type of world, right, without any sort of differentiation, would be in complete stasis, because there's nothing to resist anything else, nothing, no conflict, no strife. So determinations, what something is, can only come out from sort of the one conflicting with itself, in the same way that the Eddy sort of conflicts with itself through all these various objects and processes being sort of intertwined. So the world kind of breaks itself apart, if you will, according to Schelling. And I think this is sort of an interesting view. I don't know if I would want to go too far with this. I may be going to go further with this kind of view, but the world sort of breaks itself apart, differentiates itself, creates opposition and strife, and through that strife, there's a sort of creative action to create more complexity and more objects, right? And through contrast and through this conflict arises any form of identity, right? What something is. And it can only come from also in the same time thinking about what the object is not, right? For otherwise, we have no way of contrasting the identity with something other. So not only do we need strife and conflict, but through that identity, through an inner identity, say the Eddy, the inner identity of the Eddy is basically described only through its relationship with the outer, right? The river basically being on the outside of the Eddy. So to put it another way, the notion of an internal unity, say of the Eddy or an object or a chair, presupposes something external that is in opposition towards its own set of determinations. Now, we recall an earlier stream, right? One of the types of things that I said is that there is a sort of minimal notion of what we need in identity, right? That is, we need a set of determinations, and we need and we need to contrast those sets of determinations with something which means that it needs some sort of mutual material and incompatibility with something else. And without that, we don't have, according to me, jack shit in the world, right? And as soon as we do, I think this fundamentally brings the notion of normativity back into the world, among other certain types of interesting other sets of ontological tools like powers, which I'll probably do in another lecture. But powers are basically a view of making sense of the word of causation. There are many types of views in philosophy of causation. There's like a sort of causal primitivism, causal eliminativism. So like Russell thought that we shouldn't even use causes. Primitivism means that we should sort of what was it? Got to try to remember what I meant by primitivism real quick. He'll come to me here in a second. Oh yeah, so basically being sort of deflationary about it, like Hume was, in terms of let's not view causes and effects as necessarily holding, but as being a matter of habit. That would be a form of causal primitivism. Or say a counterfactual dependency of causes, which would be something like what's his name? Lewis would hold, right? So a Lewisian version of causation might be to say the claim that A cause B amounts to A being one of the, it's the claim that A is caused by B amounts to A being one of the causes of B, such that B would have not occurred had A not occurred. So B cannot occur unless A occurs, and if A doesn't occur, B doesn't occur, and there we have that sort of counterfactual dependence in the Lewisian account of causation. But anyways, these are the other forms of causation that are sort of rampant within, say, analytic philosophy. And I wanted to hold a powers view, and I think that powers view sort of naturally attaches itself to this type of process ontology that we have. Especially because I think powers are something that adhere or are constitutive of the various types of processes that we're going to talk about. So objects are nothing more than the set of powers that objects are nothing more than the properties that they exhibit, and the properties are a sort of byproduct of powers or processes. Or another way of talking about it are dispositional qualities. So let's see, what have I talked about? Oh yeah, so this notion of normativity basically being within the world of how certain types of things are leads to one other thing that I think is sort of prominent within my picture of metaphysics, and that's the sort of Heraclitean idea of unity in difference. Only through difference, only through strife and conflict can we create, again, an inner unity of any sort, but that unity is not going to be something that persists in and of itself, but always dynamically through its engagement with the outside world. So to kind of break down of what I've been saying so far, if everyone's been following, hold on, does process ontology have its roots? Yeah, it has its roots in Heraclitus. It perhaps has its roots even before Heraclitus, but the Heraclitean idea of unity in opposites, this idea of everything being in flux, seems to have its roots in Heraclitus. One thing to note, that Heraclitus, when he says phrases, right, I mean, we have the Heraclitean idea that you can never step in the same river twice because it's always a new river, is sort of over talked about in terms of the flux idea, right? It's true that everything is in flux in process ontology, and it's true that Heraclitus thought that everything was in flux, but it's also true for Heraclitus that he had a sense of unity, and I also think I have a sense of unity, which I wanted to sort of expound on later on, because again, if we look at the sort of Heraclitean quote that we can't step in the same river twice, we should emphasize the word same, the same river twice, right? So obviously he saw some sort of unity within this ever-changing dynamic flux of what he called the river, right? Something that seemed to persist, or something that seemed to change, because if we didn't have that identity that persisted in some at least in some capacity, then we wouldn't be talking about change, but we'd be talking about destruction. But if there's flux, then you can step in the same river twice. Well, I don't see how that follows. So the idea is that you're getting a constant new stream of fluids. You're getting a constant new, you're getting a sort of constant new set of processes being in the sort of mix. I mean, to an extent, right? I mean, obviously, we're still dealing with fluid dynamics no matter what at all times. So again, let's go back to, now that we kind of went through a sort of introduction, let's go to attacking substance ontology. Or actually, yeah, let me go through examples of where we might fall into problems of object-oriented ontology and subject and substance-oriented ontology or oriented ontology. So I'm kind of using these interchangeably. There are various philosophers that are not going to be using substance and objects interchangeably, and I think there's a good reason to not use them interchangeably. But here's the reason why I'm using these interchangeably, and why it doesn't matter whether we take subjects or objects as being true. That if we take either one, we're still going to have these sets of problems. This is what I'm going to talk about. So generally, by an object, we don't necessarily, according to some people, think that we hold some sort of underlying identity underneath all the various accidents. Oh, actually, I should probably explain what the essence accident distinction is, but I'll probably have to go over Aristotle first in that case. So Aristotle held that there are what we know as substances in the world, and he held that substances need to exist because we need to accommodate for unities or inner unities of objects existing. So when we look at trees, right, we see that it's withering away. We see the various leaves falling off. We see that it's aging. We see the bark maybe being torn off, but it's still the same tree. Why is it the same tree? Because there's some sort of underlying essence or some sort of underlying substance. And substances being sort of property barriers. And so that's why we sort of have to posit substances, something underlying that's persisting, resisting the change itself. That's not the various types of accidences, because as we know, the leaves, in virtue of them being accidences, do fall off, but we'd still talk about the same tree. Same thing for human beings, right? We change personalities like an actor changes their masks in a way. And as well, if we got rid of substances altogether, well, there would be the notion of not talking about change, but talking about destruction, because we wouldn't be talking about the same type of thing at all. So that's sort of what a substance is, right? An object barrier of sorts, or an underlining identity. For Aristotle, this underlining entity wasn't an extra metaphysical or supernatural entity. It was just actually a part of natural entities, a part of the tree itself. So objects, as opposed to substances, are kind of, I think, very similar to that, right? They're not going to postulate an underlying entity, but no matter what, we're going to have this type of scheme of where we're talking about the object qua object, and the object in virtue of its properties. And you could have essential properties, or you could just say the object is entirely made of accidental properties, which, you know, a person like Hume would with, say, a bundle theory, right? So a bundle theory, as opposed to a substance theory, would just say that there is no underlying essential characteristic, while a bundle theorist would say that it's just all of its accidents, right? And here I want to say that I think they're both misguided, because I think they both kind of do the same thing, is that there's an identity that we attach predicates onto, and this resists and persists change in some sort of way, at least nominally or essentially. And this sort of subject-predicate relationship, I think, falls apart in certain types of examples, and I'll give these types of examples. So when we say phrases like "it's raining," or it is raining, right? What exactly are we referring to with the copula is, and what exactly are we referring to it in the phrase it is raining? We're kind of, I think, found a little bit disgruntled by that by that problem, right? We don't necessarily attribute any one object to the process rain. We could say the rain droplets. We can say individual rain droplets. We can say clouds. We can say certain other types of things like, I don't know, talking about the wind working in a certain type of way, although that's generally not, I guess, attributed to rain. But we know that none of these things are sufficient. Although they're necessary, they're not sufficient in order to describe what rain is in itself, right? When we talk about rain, we're not talking about simple cases such as discrete entities existing. We're talking about the various dynamic processes of all these things working in a sort of extended, temporally extended repertoire, right? And it's sort of even in a cyclical way, since we see things like rain cycles, right? Or water cycles, rather. We also have other types of cycles like rock cycles. And the sort of repertoire processes doesn't have the same type of subject, sort of subject that we can attach predicates onto. So here I think there's this sort of one problem of object-oriented ontology that I wanted to get up at. A next type of problem is that object-oriented ontology, due to it being made of discrete entities, is going to lend itself into problems of causation. What type of problems is it going to lead in terms of causation? Well, obviously the Humean one of how do we know, if we're, say, causal primitivists, of how A interacts with B other than through habit, right? So if we're familiar with Hume's problem of causation, or the way that he wants to say that causation occurs, is that when a billiard ball hits another billiard ball, and these being two discrete entities, they're not being processes that are extended in time, always follow hypothetically, and always follow not, which means not necessarily, and would have no necessarily therefore they would have no necessary connection, and therefore leaves the problem of how causation basically occurs between these two separate entities. Right, so that's, I think, a second problem of object-oriented ontology. And I'm not sure if I can think off of the third, but I know I had a third critique of this somewhere when I've researched this, but hopefully that will be enough at least to dabble in. Okay, so do we have any questions so far? I'm going to read. But he can be someone responding to him. Okay. Okay, so let me see. What else do I want to talk about? Okay, so I wanted to talk about, I guess, get a little bit more of the substance before I continue. So one thing that I wanted to avoid is not talking about inner unities, but talking about substances as something that's completely ontologically contained. And again, I brought up the definition of ontological containment earlier. For Aristotle, substances were the only things that really existed. I don't think, as far as I know, that he thought relations exist. In this type of ontology that I'm espousing, relations are real. They're not just going to be qualities of substances. And so therefore I don't have this sort of problem of how accidences fall off of substances. Why is this a problem? Because look at someone like Leibniz. Leibniz held that only substances can exist as well, and that causal interactions, efficient causation, cannot possibly exist. Why? Because in order for something to affect another thing, it would have to affect it through efficient cause of where one accident falls off of another thing, and then it passes it on to the other object, but passing something on from one object to another object means that the accident leaves its essence or its substance, of which it can't do, because by definition, accidences are that which depend on its substance or its essence. Accidences cannot exist by definition, according to Leibniz, outside of substances. I'm sure that Aristotle had a great way of working out that problem himself. Leibniz didn't try to work out that problem. He basically said that there is a pre-established harmony, basically, I think, of God and these substances working together such that we think we see causation, but it's actually just everything is just perfectly aligned. So this is why one of the reasons why I wanted to avoid substance ontology, right, is that showing this sort of attachment to the substance of where things can't work relationally, aren't even constituted relationally, but are instead monadic, or meaning singular, simple entities. Instead, the types of entities that I'll be talking about, namely process entities, are always going to be working dynamically, relationally. And as a matter of fact, according to sort of structuralist thesis, which I seem to be holding here, they can't exist without their structural relation to other types of processes. And here I want you to think of things like gravity, even working, say, within a repertoire within an organism. Now we can imagine, right, a counterfactual world of where gravity didn't exist. And if that was the case, there'd be a lot of sort of biological and chemical processes, even if they could exist without gravity. If they could, all right, then they would exist in a very different way, even if they could. They probably couldn't, but if they could, then they would exist in a very odd way. So does it really make sense to talk about an object without all these various types of processes like electromagnetism or gravitational force, right? It doesn't seem, according to a structuralist view and the process ontologist view, that they can. And the sort of internal organization of whatever type of process that we're talking about, or if we want object, as long as we know those are constituted by processes, are just this, again, this repertoire expression of these various powers. And so then this leads me to talking about what exactly an object is. So I don't want to deny objects altogether, as much as I don't want to, deny the Eddy right here, because obviously there is something that we call an object, or something that we at least nominally define as an object there. Nor do I want to deny, trees as existing in some way. What I want to deny is the substance or object view altogether as being primary or fundamental. So what I think is sort of an identity view is nothing more than spatial temporal self-containment and like-partedness. So a good philosopher, Johann Seipp, maybe I'm mispronouncing his name, called these automeridity and homeomeridity. And then when you have both together, when a thing is like-parted and contained to some degree, it's contained to some spatial temporal degree, and it has certain types of parts that are working in repertoire, when it has certain things that are like-parted, then we can consider it an object. Generally, the more contained it is and the more identical it is, the more the object seems to hold some sort of demarcation point between others. I wouldn't say that this is a hard demarcation point, but I would say it's a fairly good demarcation point when we're dealing with, say, biological systems. So let me give some sort of concrete examples of what I mean by these sorts of soft demarcation points, right? And why we need some level of ontological containment for, say, talking about organisms, right? So what's a good way of describing, say, like a pathogen, right, in a human body instead of a microbe? So when a human body basically comes into contact with a certain type of pathogen and it makes the body sick, the thing that demarcates the point of whether it's just an ordinary microbe instead of a pathogen would be the immunity system, and the immunity system selecting to attack that pathogen as opposed to not attacking it where it wouldn't actually be a pathogen, right? So we actually are constituting the very identity of this foreign piece of matter as evading the body if and only if the immunity system attacks it. In some cases it doesn't, but let's say in most cases where it does. And now we know that this actually doesn't have any sort of like-partedness with the identity of a body, and therefore is not ontologically contained within the identity of the body, particularly its notion and its relation to the immunity system. This is interesting, I think, right? So here we do have an identity, and it's selected by certain types of biological constraints, like, again, the immunity system. And there does seem to be something, I think, top down that's working in any organism that seems to be showing us how the body seems to be operating. Seems to be also, at the same time, rejecting what types of foreign microbes can enter into the body. And so that's just sort of what I mean by this notion of identity as being sort of soft, a sort of soft ontological containment. So again, just to run it again one more time with that example, more precisely, there is no intrinsic or essential form of pathogenicity. In this example, and there have been some sort of philosophers of biology that argue that the ecological context of where a pathogen is located is in fact, in one context, going to be a pathogen, and in another context, something might help that biological organism, right? It's going to have a symbiosis, and this notion of symbiosis is also sort of what I mean by a repertoire of a dynamic repertoire of processes working together, constituting what an object is. And in this sense, again, the symbiosis would then constitute a portion of the organism's identity. Similarly, people like John Dupree and Nicholson had made the argument that organisms, in fact, need to be understood as a fundamentally dynamic open system. I emphasize the open. The moment that a biological system is no longer interacting with its surrounding environment, a thermodynamic equilibrium ensues. Such a philosophy, I think, is also not just known by contemporary ontologists or contemporary philosophers of biology. There's some very interesting work produced by the German idealists that I think had maybe a sort of, how do I put it? I know there's a better word than this, but the sort of, original sort of pioneers of, I guess, biological entities, of where they also posited that in order for us to express an inner identity, we need to presuppose an outer identity. And only through the inner is there an outer, right? These are not in opposition to these are not completely in opposition with each other, but sort of have a unity in opposition, right? Sort of cantus firmus ensues. Another example might be, take for example, snake venom, and this is an example that Schelling viewed. Snake venom is not poisonous to the snake, right? Poison is not poisonous at all, except to the extent that the body makes it so. So here we can only make sense of two relations in terms of a third, or that which relates the two. Right, so the poison is basically only a poison in virtue of its relation to two other types of entities. So hopefully that gives you a sort of structure of what the identity, an identity theory under a process ontologist view would be, some sort of examples of what process ontology is like, the definition of a process ontology. And so I'm now going to be going into a dynamic account of causation, and hopefully I'll probably pull up some more pictures, but this shouldn't be too hard to obviously get, or to understand rather. Hold on, let me bring up the pictures just real quick. Not a big picture. Not a very complicated thing. Although, the funny thing is that we have such a limited understanding of how causation generally works that we confuse ourselves into thinking that it must work linearly, while we have many types of examples, obviously, where it does not need to do that. So I wanted to go over a sort of perceptual view of causation. Again, I wanted to start out with what causation is not. I think it's always good to begin with a sort of negative and then move on to what causation is and how a dynamic how a dynamic view of causation works. And I think a dynamic view of causation is going to be fundamentally diachronic instead of, it's fundamentally synchronic instead of diachronic, but I'll get into that later. So I wanted to first say what causation is not. I wanted to attack, as he's one of my favorite whipping boys, is David Hume and his view of causation. And perhaps one of the largest assumptions in their view of causation is that it is a relation that relates two events or objects that take place in a diachronic sequence. Probably more emphasis on the events than objects, since a lot of people want to view causation as a relation between events than objects. So here we sort of imagine, when we say, when we look at the Humean version of causation, two clear, distinct, discrete events occurring in an extended period where one object affects the other unidirectionally, giving priority to causes. What I mean by giving priority to causes, the cause always precedes the effect, right? We always move from A to B, and this is generally how we sort of view causation. So such a picture is precisely painted by David Hume in The Inquiry when he's describing the role of causation as something that, quote, must be derived from some relation among objects, in which the necessary connection between the two events is imagined to be no more than, quote, a fiction of the imagination, resulting from the mind's, quote, propensity to spread itself onto the object. So what are we saying here? To be more precise and in a more Humean way, the world is constantly conjoined by habit through causal inferences, which inhibit the belief of a continuous causal process from generating. Why? Because A and B are only through constant conjunction, through habit alone, conjoined, right? But there's sort of easy answers to why this type of view doesn't work. So the easiest sort of notion of why A shouldn't always precede B, and why causation isn't always linear, why it's always not between two discrete points, is in the view of, well, the dynamic view of causation, of where A causes B and B causes A. Now, we can kind of ask how this exactly happens. How does B go back into causing A after A causes B, right? Wouldn't that be sort of a notion of reverse causation, or working backwards in time? But that sort of misunderstands the point of what exactly this type of causation is supposed to do. So instead of viewing causation as something that is fundamentally temporal and diachronic, we should view it synchronic, that is happening instantaneously, or simultaneously, it should be the better word, or at the same time. So that while A is causing B, at the same time B is causing A, in which we're establishing a repertoire or a dynamic form of causation. What's an example of this view, right? Well, we can easily bring up sort of a lot of examples. Say a sugar cube being dissolved in, say, water, right? Here, when a sugar cube is being dissolved in water, we will say something like the sugar cube caused, we could say that the water caused the sugar cube to be dissolved, right? A to B relationship, linear. You can describe this in terms of Humean forms of causation. However, we can also view a sort of inverse effect of not only the cube being dissolved by water and therefore being caused by water, but the sugar cube saturating the water as well. And so when the sugar cube saturates the water, right, this isn't distinct from the water also dissolving the sugar cube. They're the exact same thing, except working in a way dynamically, right? Is that there isn't just always a one-way directional cause and effect relationship. It's that when one thing causes another, there's a sort of inverse effect of where that thing is also causing or has its own causally efficacious power being exerted on the opposite object or the object that's acting upon it. And so we generally then think that all forms of causation must be exactly how David Hume thinks, which, according to me, a few other other philosophers, is sort of wrong, right? And when we tend to think of this, right, we tend to think of this sort of Humean causation in the Anglo-American idiom, when we say things like the thrown rock caused the window to shatter, the engine caused the engine to start, the fire caused the trees to burn. These are all examples that were brought to me in a book, but that's in fact not entirely what's going on, right? When we throw a rock at a window, sure, it breaks, but the rock itself also goes through some form of destruction. So what's the sort of problem with this view, the sort of Humean view, is that we're sort of transforming the world, if you want, into a sort of disunified, fragmented, mereological sum. Things are always piecemeals. A always causes B, as if A is somehow derivative or apart from B. This obviously goes against the process view in terms of, well, if all processes are dynamic, if they're working sort of synchronically, which I've just shown, they can't possibly function as two discrete entities. There's also some problems with the Lewisian view of causation that I'll probably go over at another time in another video. But the problem of counterfactual dependence also has this sort of discrete, fragmented view. And one of the great things is that, these types of dynamic views were already, they were probably already considered by Newton, but they were, I think, exemplified quite extensively as soon as Kant came about, especially within his natural sciences. So a lot of people read the Critique of Pure Reason. They read, the metaphysics of morals, or the metaphysical foundations of morals. One thing that they don't read is his account of Natura Philosophy, his natural philosophy, where he shows that everything within the heavens and the earth, but really in nature, works in this sort of dynamic repertoire. So again, this sort of notion of continuous, simultaneous, continuous and simultaneous sort of on opposition, but sort of this notion of continuous temporal processes, of where in that continuous operation there are simultaneous activities, obviously a conjoined or a conjunction of many different types of processes working at the same time, interdependently and synchronically. So if we have this view of a dynamic account of causation, right, we kind of move on to holistic systems of where A causes B and B causes C and C causes A and A causes C, right? This is generally how causation tends to occur, not in a linear fashion, not in a sort of counterfactual dependence, but in one of where things where operations seem to work holistically. And so here, right, we have what I was talking about earlier, just a bad picture, some sort of ontological containment, soft containment. We still need to, obviously, that say if we're talking about an organism, the organism is going to be affecting and being affected by its outside external environment. However, there is some sort of soft containment in the sense of, like, say, the immunity system that I brought out. And the immunity system, or say homosynthesis, or say, metabolism, is all functioning in a sort of dynamic way. And I think that dynamic view of causation probably has to occur top down. I've had a lot of debates about why it doesn't necessarily have to work top down. I find that very counterintuitive, that everything in a biological system seems to be operating under its parts, and those parts in front of due to their parts, and their parts due to particles and chemistry, and going all the way down. I don't know if that's the right way of going about it, because when we have relations and dynamic systems, there seem to be certain types of processes that emerge in those dynamic systems that just don't exist if we consider things in their parts, right? That just seems like a mereological fallacy to me. And that's why I suggest top-down systems might emerge, say, in biology. So also we should notice that causation here, since it is continuous, does not come to a completion. It's never going to be in stasis. However, that's not to say that causation doesn't have something that it doesn't want to achieve. So here's what some people think I'm crazy about, and that's buying into teleology. I think teleology just sort of, and teleology being defined as goal-orientated activities or purposes that things want to obtain. Some people think I'm crazy for holding this type of view. So here's where I think that this sort of teleology comes in, is that systems, right? Systems seem to try to functionally achieve a goal. So for example, again, we try to maintain our bodily temperatures at a consistent 98.6 degrees or whatever it is. There might be certain types of factors which might increase it, but the body generally has a dispositional tendency, right? Power in it that would counterbalance these forces that would try to heat up the body too much. And to me, that seems like the body is attempting to fulfill an end-directed function. Now, it continuously does that, because as soon as it stops doing anything, right, we're no longer talking about processes at all. We're talking about, well, dead things. So we should avoid, therefore, the notion of absolute completion, right? But we should maybe, again, hold on to what I want to call a soft completion, just in the same sense that I wanted to talk about a soft ontological containment. So now that I kind of went over a dynamic form of causation, what that means, how it works sort of holistically, I'm going to move on to the agent and the subject, what it means to perceive certain types of things, and sort of avoid a mechanistic explanation of the subject, of where we're just talking about us reacting to stimuli, and us just being products of antecedent conditions, of where everything is deterministic and we have no free will, blah, blah, blah. Right? And it's the sort of old picture of where everything happens because of a reason, and that reason is, above and over anything that we particularly could have manifested in the world, and of where we have no agency. Really bad forms of philosophy. Sorry for those who have a hard deterministic stance. I don't mean to offend. There are definitely some philosophers out there that believe this and have written papers about it. So there's a general view, right, when we're dealing with agency and subjectivity, that there's a natural tendency of viewing the subject in generally presentistic ways. What do I mean by presentistic? As something that, again, stands over and above different types of periods, generally that which presents itself in the present moment, right? And generally mechanistically, in terms of us being nothing more than a machine that reacts towards, that is being acted upon by various types of things, various types of objects, and even further, that when a subject is empirically viewing events, that there's that it is basically viewing things only in terms of causal mechanisms. That there's only a purely causally motivated explanation to why we perceive things and why we act certain types of ways intentionally. What can process ontology do to sort of prevent that view is what I'm going to go over. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is, again, the causal theory of reference, and how one says that certain types of sensations in the human body, which are caused by things outside of us, produce perceptual events. And we see those perceptual events and we just say those are caused by external objects, and that's how we get references, right? That's how we know that the referent is out there, the subject is in here, hoo-ha, we get all the information from that type of explanation alone. So there are 3 errors, I think, that are at work that I basically believe undetermine the facts for our experiences in these scenarios. The first is that no amount of causal theories is sufficient to explain what I'll call the sui generis character of our agency. Someone made fun of me before for using the word sui generis and saying that I flexed, and then I didn't explain what sui generis meant at the time, so I'll explain what I mean by sui generis. It just means uniquely of its own type. So there is something about our agency that's unique, a form of human exceptionalism. These things just aren't exhibited in other types of objects. The second, that our mind is not caught in the present at all, but consistently retrieves the past using its memory and retention, as well as constantly projects itself into the future, whereby it envisions plans that are heavily inferential. So we're not just, being caused by external things, and then we just do things, right? We think about the past, we think about the future. We're not just caught in the present moment. And the last is that the mistake is that perceptual experiences are completely passive, which seems to be rejected by, the sort of dynamic theory of causation that I've gone over, as well as our use of epistemic justification. And all these facts and refutations are writ large processual. So let's get on to, now that I've sort of talked about what I'm going to talk about, I'm going to go over a little bit more in depth about those types of issues. So the causal theory of reference, I'll deem it the CTR, has a problem in producing normative explanations about our perceptual experiences. So when we say that things cause our perceptual experiences, right, and that we're just completely satisfied by a causal explanation, seems to be sort of misguided, because it doesn't tell us, it doesn't show us the sort of normative nature of our perceptions. It doesn't tell us what we ought to be experiencing in our perceptual events that refers to the world. Why is it important that we get what we ought to be witnessing within the world? Well, the biggest thing, obviously, is that we're in error very often, or at least somewhat often, about our perceptual experiences, right? Error, therefore, presupposes that we need a criterion in which to distinguish error from non-error in perceptual experiences. So we need to then have not only a causal explanation, but we need an inferential justification for why we're perceiving the things that we do in the world. Now, you can say that inferences are nothing more than causal explanations, but causal explanations, just in the way that they're made, are just not going to be the species of things that are going to explain anything in the way that we mean by explaining with justification. How do we know that this causal explanation is erroneous and not erroneous? You can't explain it through another type of causal justification, because that's only going to then push the problem of how we know that that causal explanation is the correct one, as opposed to another one. We'll always need some sort of inferential justification which can justify that this perceptual act is correct. Not only this, but the CTR, or the causal theory of reference, needs to presuppose, needs to create an account of why identical forms of stimuli can have distinct propositional content. So for example, let's say that we see a tree outside, right? Presumably, when I see a tree and I step in the same place as another person who sees the same thing, and let's just say that our bodies are just about identical in almost every single functional way, except a few things that are sort of insignificant. The same type of stimuli, say the tree affecting my body, would produce two sets of different propositional attitudes about the tree itself. Why is that? If causal explanations are sufficient in order to demonstrate our theory of reference? Well, it's because it's not sufficient, because there seems to be more at work than just bare perceptual acts that bring about the tree, right? It's mainly also being able to make a set of inferences. And the inferences that I might make might lead me to different types of conclusions, especially if they're wrong. So we need to always justify our perceptual acts. As a matter of fact, I think all of our perceptual acts are propositionally latent, as I've said in some of my other videos. And we need to see how these propositional perceptual acts relate to what Wilfred Sellars calls the logical space of reasons. Now, as I've described before in some of my other videos, the logical space of reasons is basically the sort of web of beliefs that we have that we use to justify any of our new founding beliefs. So if we have a new perceptual event, say of the tree, we could be in error, we could not be, but the only way of knowing that is by bringing this new perceptual act that's propositional and seeing if it checks out with our other beliefs, our other webs of beliefs, or our other sort of constellations of commitments that we have. Constellation of commitments. So that's just sort of getting rid of the sort of mechanistic notion that we're just, passively receiving things and there's no activity by the agent. The other sort of fault of this sort of mechanistic scheme is that when we're seeing certain types of things affect us, we have no spontaneity of retrieving memories or projecting ourselves into future events of where, obviously, as human beings like us, ourselves, we would obviously do things a little bit differently than, say, a rock doing things, right? So the ability of retention, the ability of getting memories from the past that can help me inform me of what I'm seeing or what I'm about to do is obviously tenemont to human beings. And the ability of projecting themselves into the future, of where we're going to make actions that yet don't exist, bringing about states of affairs that do not yet exist because we will them into existence to some extent, seems to be a notion of human spontaneity that isn't reducible down to mechanistic explanations. And this should also, I think, exemplify the sort of notion of dynamic systems and dynamic forms of causation then, right? So it's not that we passively receive certain types of information of where we deduce that there's a tree, but rather we make a series of inferences, my inferential justifications that are alongside my perceptual acts, have a dynamic relationship with the actual content such that I produce certain types of beliefs. So this gets us away from the sort of notion of complete passivity to a dynamic activity and passivity as what's needed for agency and the subject, all I think, that require deliberation, inferences, an extended amount of time, which I think is on par with the notion of process ontology. So this is just a list of things that I wanted to go over. I've been going for about an hour and 20 minutes. Kind of going to wrap this up. Since I've gone over agency, I've gone over causation, I've gone over perception, I've gone over identity, I've gone over examples of various different things for an hour and 20 minutes, hopefully giving you a kind of piece of why I want, of where I want to go with my metaphysics. Sometime in the future, I want to go over some more esoteric ideas of how the entire world has a minimal form of agency, which, presupposes a minimal amount of purposefulness. I see purposefulness within the world. I see, because of that purposefulness, or maybe this because of that, let me reverse it. I see, I think a lot of people see this sort of holism in the world, of where there's a uniformity of nature, and that uniformity of nature might not be exemplified in microphysics. It might not be exemplified in the same sense of where we're getting a holistic repertoire of things working in the way that we do when we kind of distance ourselves and look in the stars or the galaxies. And that when we do look at the stars and galaxies and the vast universe, there does seem to be a sort of uniformity towards it. There seems to be a law-like fashion towards it that is not exemplified in in maybe more micro level states. And one thing I hear that I want to caution here, and I think Jonathan Schafer also sort of cautions against this view, is that we should not be so ready to accept the idea that everything in the universe that's macro level or macro orientated can be reducible down to micro orientated explanations. We could think of it instead as a top-down process of where the top influences the bottom, or what we could do is think of things ontologically flat. That is, we shouldn't value or prioritize any particular set of systems, say the biological, chemical, particle, quantum mechanics, whatever, or if we're investigating cosmology, as being able to champion all other levels. So I haven't yet, although I have a tendency of thinking things top down, I also do like the ontological flat view, and I think that might be where I might in the future go. So far, just to wrap it all up again, the issues that I'm concerned here are process ontology and the possible alternative to substance ontology. The flaws that I sort of pointed out was the inability of a subject or a substance for various processes such as rain that I brought up earlier, but this can also be applied to electricity, tornadoes. Another deficiency is the ability to explain exactly what is persisting through all these dynamic changes. So, say, if you look at biological systems, say an infant going into an adult, what some people think, even biologists think, that there is nothing that retains essentially throughout its full lifespan. Even the genes change. Even the genes change. Even DNA changes, according to certain types of philosophy of biologists. Sorry, the philosophers of biology. So by contrast, I propose that the identity is nothing but change in its dynamic relationships to the outside world. To reiterate, an organism's causal features are underdetermined by purely intrinsic relationships. Now, those require some sort of interdependence between the environment and itself, some sort of repertoire, and that the process view has a way of making sense through it through the dynamic view of causation. And that we have a greater chance of explaining what a human being is through causation, through a processual account, along with certain forms of sciences like biology. Here I have, again, in mind a great book which I've before endorsed by Daniel J. Nicholson and John Dupuy, is Everything Flows Towards a Process Philosophy of Biology, of where I've gotten a lot of notes through here. Other types of works that are really great in discovering or sort of unpacking this might be Schelling's account of Naturphilosophy, Kant's idea of Naturphilosophy. I mean, also knowing what the comparison or what we're sort of attacking here, it might pay to read Aristotle's account of substances, right? Or say Leibniz's views of monads is something that we're attacking. And I think that sort of concludes this sort of session on process ontology. I've been talking about an hour and 30 minutes. I'll open up some questions here about this. Hopefully this will be interesting enough. I noticed that there's a few more people that kind of gotten in here since I've started, but this will go over some of my sort of metaphysics, and hopefully some of these things will pop up in some of the debates that I've had in the future. So yeah, okay guys, we're done with that. We're done with that.